All right, Darl. Paul stands beside the bed. From behind his leg, Vardamon peers with his round head and his eyes round and his mouth beginning to open. She looks at Paul. All her failing life appears to drain into her eyes. Urgent, irremediable. It's Jewel she wants, Darl says. Why, Addie, Paul says. Him and Darl went to make one more load. They thought there was time, that you would wait for them, and that $3 and all. He stoops, laying his hands on hers for a while, yet she looks at him without reproach, without anything at all, as if her eyes alone are listening to the irrevocable cessation of his voice. Then she, raising herself, who has not moved in 10 days, Dewey Dow leans down, trying to press her back. Ma, she says, Ma. So Dewey Dow's a girl. She's looking out the window at Cash, stooping steadily at the board in the failing light, laboring on toward darkness and into it as though the stroking of the saw illumined its own motion, board and saw engendered. You, Cash, she shouts, her voice harsh, strong and unimpaired. You, Cash. He looks up at the gaunt face framed by the window in the twilight. It is a composite picture of all the time he was a child. He drops the saw and lifts the board for her to see. Watching the window in which the face has not moved, he drags a second plank into position, slants the two of them into their final juxtaposition, gesturing toward the ones yet on the ground, shaping with his empty hand in pantomime the finished box. For a while still she looks down at him from the composite picture, neither with censure nor approbation. Then the face disappears. She lies back and turns her head without so much as glancing at Pa. She looks at Vardamon, her eyes, the life in them rushing suddenly upon them. The two flames glare up for a steady instant, then they go out as though someone had leaned down and blown upon them. Not blown them up, blown upon them, like blown onto them. Ma, Dewey Dow says, Ma, leaning above the bed, her hands lifted a little, the fan still moving like it has for 10 days. She begins to keen. Her voice is strong, young, tremulous and clear, wrapped with its own timbre and volume, the fan still moving steadily up and down, whispering the useless air. Then she flings herself across Addie Bundren's knees, clutching her, shaking her with the furious strength of the young, before sprawling suddenly across a handful of rotten bones that Addie Bundren left, jarring the whole bed into a chattering sibilance of mattress shucks, her arms outflung and the fan in one hand still beating with expiring breath into the quilt. From behind Pa's leg, Vardamon peers, his mouth full open, and all color draining from his voice into his mouth, as though he has by some means fleshed his own teeth into himself. Sucking, he begins to move slowly backwards from the bed, his eyes round, his pale face fading into the dusk like a piece of paper pasted on a failing wall, and so out of the door. Pa leans above the bed in twilight, his humped silhouette partaking of that owl-like quality of awry, feathered, disgruntled outrage within which lurks a wisdom too profound or too inert for even thought. Darn them boys, he says. Jewel, I say. Overhead the day drives level and gray, hiding the sun by a light of gray spears. In the rain the mules smoke a little, splashed yellow with mud. They off, one clinging in sliding lunges to the side of the road above the ditch. The tilted lumber gleams dull yellow, water soaked and heavy as lead, tilted at a steep angle into the ditch above the broken wheel. About the shattered spokes and about Jewel's ankles, a runway of yellow, neither water nor earth swirls, curving with the yellow road, neither of earth nor water, down the hill, dissolving into a streaming mass of dark green, neither of earth nor sky. Jewel, I say. Cash comes to the door carrying the saw. Pa stands beside the bed, humped, his arms dangling. He turns his head, his shabby profile, his chin collapsing slowly as he works the snuff against his gums. She's gone, Cash says. She taken and left, as Pa says. Cash does not look at him. How nigh are you done, Pa says. Cash does not answer. He enters carrying the saw. I reckon you better get at it, Pa says. You have to do the best you can with them boys gone off that-a-way. Cash looks down at her face. He is not listening to Pa at all. He does not approach the bed. He stops in the middle of the floor, the saw against his leg, his sweating arms powdered lightly with sawdust, his face composed. If you get in a tight, maybe some of them will get here tomorrow and help you, Pa says. Vernon could. Cash is not listening. He is looking down at her peaceful, rigid face, fading into the dusk as though darkness were a precursor of the ultimate earth. Until at last the face seems to float detached upon it, lightly as a reflection of a dead leaf. There is Christians enough to help you, Pa says. Cash is not listening. After a while, he turns without looking at Pa and leaves the room. Then the saw begins to snore again. They will help us in our sorrow, Pa says. The sound of the saw is steady, competent, unhurried, stirring the dying light so that at each stroke her face seems to wake a little into an expression of listening and of waiting as though she were counting the strokes. Pa looks down at the face, at the black sprawl of Dewey Dow's hair, the outflung arms, the clutched fan now motionless on the fading quilt. I reckon you better get supper on, he says. Dewey Dow does not move. Get up now and put supper on, Pa says. We gotta keep our strength up. I reckon Dr. Peabody right hungry, coming all this way, and Cash will need to eat quick and get back to work so he can finish it in time. Dewey Dow rises, heaving to her feet. She looks down at the face. It is like a casting of fading bronze upon the pillow. The head's alone still, with any semblance of life. A curled, gnarled inertness, a spent yet alert quality from which weariness, exhaustion, travail have not yet departed, as though they doubted even yet the actuality of rest, guarding with horn and penurious alertness the cessation which they know cannot last. Dewey Dow stoops and slides the quilt from beneath them and draws it up over them to the chin, smoothing it down, drawing it smooth, and without looking at Pa, she goes around the bed and leaves the room. She will go out where Peabody is, where she can stand in the twilight and look at his back with such an expression that, filling her eyes and turning, he will say, I will not let it grieve me now. She was old and sick too, suffering more than she knew. She couldn't have got well. Vardaman's getting big now, and with you to take good care of them all, I would try not to let it grieve me. I expect you better go and get some supper ready. It don't have to be much, but they'll need to eat. And she looking at him, saying, you could do so much for me if you just would. If you just knew I am I and you are you, and I know it and you don't know it, and you could do so much for me if you just would. If you just would, then I could tell you, and then nobody would have to know it except you and me and Darl. Pa stands over the bed, dangle-armed, humped, motionless. He raises his hand to his head, scouring his hair, listening to the saw. He comes nearer and rubs his hand, palm and back, on his thigh, and lays it on her face and then on the hump of quilt where her hands are. He touches the quilt as he, Dewey Dow, do, trying to smooth it up to the chin, but disarranging it instead. He tries to smooth it again, clumsily, his hand awkward as a claw, soothing at the wrinkles which he made and which continue to emerge beneath his hand with perverse ubiquity, so that at last he desists, his hand falling to the side and stroking himself, palm and back, on his thigh. The sound of the saw snores steadily into the room. Pa breathes with a quiet, rasping sound, mouthing the snuff against his gums. God's will be done, he says. Now I can get them teeth. Jules' hat droops limp about his neck, channeling water onto the soaked toe sack tied about his shoulders as, ankle deep in the running ditch, he pries with a slipping 2x4, with a piece of rotten log for fulcrum, Fulcrum, with a piece of rotting log for fulcrum at the axle. Jewel, I say. She is dead, Jewel. Addie Bundren is dead. All right, that was the end of Darl.